So we're going to look at a way to mix two textures in Maya using Arnold. In fact, we're not just going to mix two textures, we'll mix two shaders. So we've got this kind of gem-like shader here, and then we want to superimpose this sort of painted texture on top. So if we just pop back into Maya and look at the hypershade here, let me just tear this off to make it a bit bigger. You'll see we've got there's probably more than two, but a couple of options for mixing things in Arnold. We've got the AI mix shader, which does what it sounds like, it mixes shaders. Or we have AI composite, where if we look at the attribute editor for this, you can see we can have two textures coming in here and then some sort of blend mode to mix them together, and that works pretty well. The thing that the AI mix shader has is that it's got a mix weight that we can use an alpha channel cutout or something like that to mix the two things together. So although this looks a little complicated, we just have two shaders here, 1 and 2, and one is just the gem-like shader, and then one has this file node that has a painted texture in it, which looks like this. Just two things painted in this field, and of course our object would have to be UV mapped, and it's got an alpha channel. So it's this alpha channel we're going to use in that mix attribute. Then we've got a bunch of other things going on in here. So why don't we just rebuild this from scratch to make things a little bit easier. So we'll just create an AI mix shader, and then a couple of AI standard surfaces. I'll just duplicate this. Oops, I didn't duplicate it with the input connection, so I'll just make another one. AI standard surface. Okay, so this one we'll call base material, and this one is texture overlay. So one of the reasons for using the mix shader rather than just the composite is, first, we've got that mix weight attribute, but we can also have a totally different shader structure for each one of these things. So we can have different specularities for each of these and so on. So for the base material, let me just use a preset here. Maybe jade. Okay, and then for texture overlay, so any textures we have loaded will show up here. So I'll just bring this file I already have, and the out color will be attached to the base color here. And then when we want to mix the two shaders, just take the out color of the base material, I'll put it into shader 2, and the out color of the base or the texture overlay into shader 1. Then we can take the out alpha of this file node, and again, just as a reminder, we'll pop back in here. It's this color channel, so in the RGB channel, the colors are here, but then there's an alpha channel here too, and something like this can be made just by even using the magic wand tool, Control Shift I to invert it, and then you can do things like oops. You can go to select, modify that selection. I could contract that border a little bit, and I can even then blur it after. Oops. I want to make sure I'm in the alpha channel here. And if I didn't have an alpha channel, I'll just trash this alpha channel. If I have a selection and I just click on here, it will make a new alpha channel and load up that selection. Control D to deselect. And now I've got a sharp-edged alpha channel. And I could, if I wanted to, go into filter, blur, and just Gaussian blur it. It kind of depends what you're trying to achieve here, but I can just save it like that. And then if we pop back into Maya, then we can take the out alpha and put it into the mix of the AI mix shader. And I'll show you this isn't actually going to work right away, but you can see in a second. And we assign the AI mix shader to our object. And then if we render, so we have the jade, but it's showing through the object. So our alpha channel is actually through the overlay. So our alpha channel is working in reverse here, which makes sense because the white would mix the bottom through to the top. So we can just do a reverse node, take the out alpha, go to input X, and then output X into mix, and then it reverses it properly. There's still it looks like a bump map on here from before. If we update the full scene, yep, there it's gone now. Just needed updating. So if in fact you do want to add a displacement map to something like this, you know that the displacement map always goes into the shading group. But the shading group we want to put it in is this one here. Okay, so if we just add an AI noise, and when I say this one here, I mean the one attached to the mix shader, the AI mix shader here. And then if we add a displacement and take the out color red from the noise, delete that shading group, and then take the displacement here and go into the displacement shader of the mix shader shading group, the blue one here. Just going to add an AI user data float just to attach to our scale X, scale Y, scale Z here. Let's change that to 20 so you can see it's having an effect. If I update the full scene, I guess I can close this now. Kind of struggling with the render here. I'm going to maybe turn off my subsurface scattering. Oh, it's already turned off. Not sure why it's taking quite so long. Let me just double check my subdivision settings. Oh, it's quite high. Maybe that's why. Change that to 3. It's a little unusual that it's taking so long to render here. Okay. I'm working on a file that I started earlier, so I might have some... Oh yeah, I've got the denoiser and everything turned on. But what's interesting here is if you don't want to use a displacement shader, for example, and we want to hook this up as a bump map, then because we have two different shaders, we can have a bump map on the base shader and a different one on the overlay. So if we add an AI bump 2D, take out color R, bump map from that noise, then go into the normal camera. It should render faster than this because we have the displacement turned off now. So I'm just going to double check and go in, turn off my subdivisions now. Update the full render just to make sure. It's taking a long time to render for some reason. I wonder if it's the transmission. Okay, that's a little better. I'm not sure why it's struggling so much, but you can see that. Interesting. It looks like the bump map is coming through both here. Oh, the displacement shader is still hooked up. I thought I deleted that. That's why it's taking so long. Okay, so now the bump map is just hooked up to this one here, the base material. So if I turn up to a high value, you can see it's only affecting this part and not affecting this part. So I'll just delete this entirely and just reduce this bump. Something more reasonable. So really the basis of this whole thing is simply the two shaders, base material and overlay, both going into the mix shader, and then having something to separate them, to mix them together in this mix weight. And just to make this abundantly clear, if I break this connection and I just make this bright red, this whole shader, and I put in a checkerboard texture into the mix weight, then you can see that it can mix those two shaders together that way. So whether you use your alpha channel or any other kind of black and white image to mix them, you can mix different shaders this way, and through this method you can mix different textures too. Okay, hope this is helpful.